Welcome to today's episode of Tech Tip Tuesday. We are going to be talking about binding and backing calculations and some of the basic assumptions that you need to work with in there in order to arrive at the correct calculation. So let's talk binding first. Binding, you need to know two things. You need to know basically the perimeter of your quilt and then also the available width of fabric that you have in the strips that you're cutting. And then using those numbers, we're going to arrive at the number of strips that you need to cut, which is what you need to tell your reader. So for a rectangular quilt, which the vast majority of quilts are, that's just going to be 2 times your height and 2 times your width. Simple, right? Most of you already knew that. The key here is that you need to add about an extra 10 inches to account for the amount of binding that you're going to lose when you miter a corner, and also to have enough slack so that you can make the join at the end without having to fight your quilt constantly. So adding in that extra 10 inches of buffer is really important. You don't want to end up with binding strips that perfectly match up, and then you don't have enough ability to actually fold that quilt and get a join at the end to get a complete loop of binding. The other piece of this is knowing how much width of fabric strip that you have, and if you're doing diagonal joins, which the vast majority of quilters are doing when they join binding strips to basically remove the bulk of, a square seam would add, you're actually losing additional fabric when you join all of those strips up than you would if you just took that standard 1/4 inch seam. So we've got to account for that. And the way that you do that is by basically subtracting the width of the strip. This is basically just like a stitch and flip corner, right? If we're doing a stitch and flip corner, you need to start with a square that is the exact size plus seam allowance for the corner that you want to cover with the triangle, right? It's the exact same thing happening here. It's just instead of a square, it's a big long strip on the other end of it. And so basically you need to subtract the width of the strip that you are joining in order to figure out how much actual length of binding you're going to end up with once you do all of those joins. So for a standard 42 inch width of fabric, you're going to basically be subtracting 42 minus 2.5 in order to get the available kind of fabric in a strip width once it's all said and done. And so that's generally speaking going to be dividing by 39.5 inches rather than 42 inches. It's really important here. You might not think this matters much. And for small size quilts, babies, throws, probably not going to have a huge impact, but when you get to the queen and king sizes where you're cutting, 8, 9, 10 binding strips, this really adds up along with the extra 10 inches. So make sure you're accounting for both. You don't want to end up in a situation where you cut 9 strips and you end up this much short to actually finish the binding on the quilt. That is going to make for a very unhappy customer, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Okay, so that's it for binding. Let's talk backing calculations. Now, there's more kind of ways that you can do this. I'm going to talk through what I consider best practices and why I consider those best practices. So the first thing is that you need to add an extra 8 inches around basically 8 inches to each dimension in order to account that you need a little bit of extra fabric for long arming, for basically basting that quilt. The best practice if you're sending it to a long armor is to add 4 inches on each side. So that's basically 8 inches to each dimension. That's how we arrived at that number. Most long arm quilters will not actually accept your quilt if you don't have at least that much. Now, not everybody's going to be sending their quilt to a long armor. I get it, but you still need a little bit of extra around all of the edges of your quilt, even if you're doing this at home, kind of laying it out on the floor and basting it yourself. If it's exact or, even within a couple of inches of exact, you're going to really struggle to get that quilt top laid out properly. And you run the risk of your backing not covering the entire back of your quilt, which would be really bad, right? That's a showstopper. So the recommended best practice is to add that extra 8 inches to each dimension. So you're going to take your height, you're going to add 8 inches to it, and then you're going to take your width and add 8 inches to it. And then that's kind of the size of fabric that you need to cobble together with your backing fabric. Now, one thing to note is that if you're doing like a wall hanging size, table runner size, right? Like a really small project, you don't need 8 inches, right? We're talking like 4 to 6 inches is perfectly fine. But if you're going to do that, usually in those patterns, first of all, you're going to have multiple sizes, right? So you might have a couple of small sizes that don't need the full 8 inches, but you also have a couple of larger sizes that do. So just make a note in the pattern that, you haven't accounted for 8 inches of excess on, these 2 sizes because they're smaller projects. That's perfectly fine. Sometimes that's really helpful, right? Because you'll get a baby quilt that's, 38 inches wide. And if you're comfortable with just 4 inches of overage, 2 inches around each side, which is perfectly fine for a smaller project, you need like half as much fabric as you would for a much larger size. So it's okay to do that. Just make sure that you've made a note of it in your pattern. For larger quilts, throw and up, you want to stick with that 8 inches. And then the other key piece here is that you want to keep all of your seams one direction. So you want them to all be horizontal, or you all want them to all be vertical. And that's for long arming purposes. It's really hard to load a quilt that's got kind of seams going both directions because it adds bulk in weird places, and then that can throw off the alignment of your quilting. You end up getting puckers and things like that, which we don't want. It also is really difficult to communicate without kind of full assembly diagrams how to cobble that backing together if you're going to include both vertical and horizontal seams. And that's what you're kind of seeing over here in the middle. We've got that kind of vertical seam there, which is going to throw things off for long arming, but also how do you communicate to your reader exactly which pieces they're supposed to cut, right? So a better way to do it is basically just figure out how many width of fabric strips you need across once you've made your join to basically tile it across your entire quilt. And if you end up with, a good amount of excess on the bottom, that's totally fine. Now you can do it this way, but if you're going to do it that way, you need to have some more detailed instructions about which pieces to cut and how to sew them together in order to get to the size of backing that they need, because the margins on that are much slimmer, right? If you make a mistake, there's a high likelihood you're not going to end up with enough fabric. Now, what you're seeing down on the bottom here is basically this kind of layout for backing that you would need for generally a twin quilt, because they're a different aspect ratio. So for twin quilts, you can generally get away with just 2 width of fabric strips, but you rotate them so that they're going vertically, because twin quilts tend to be longer than they are wider, in contrast to a lot of other quilts. That's less preferred from a long arming standpoint, but it's still okay. And this is still, a basic assumption that you can rely on. You don't need assembly instructions for the backing in a pattern that kind of works like this. Now, one thing to note is that I am showing each strip as 41 inches rather than the standard 42 inches. That's because most people will have been taught to join all of their backing pieces with a 1/2 inch seam allowance rather than a 1/4 inch seam allowance, just to make it a little bit more secure. If they do that, right, you want to account for that. You want to make sure they still have enough fabric, even if they decide to take a slightly larger seam allowance. If you have not included enough fabric to take that larger seam allowance, again, put a note in the pattern just so that they're aware. And they end up cutting and sewing something that they can't come back from, that ends up kind of screwing up the entire pattern for them. That's not what we want. And so the way that you kind of arrive at these quantities is once you've added that 8 inches of buffer to each dimension, you're going to figure out which way it makes more sense to do this, right? So can you cover the width of the fabric with just 2 width of fabric strips like we see down here? If you can, then we're going to go with a vertical seam. If you can't, and you've got to do 3 either way, then you're just going to go with the smaller dimensions. So that's usually the width, right? So that's what you're seeing up here. You're going to need 3 97-inch long pieces in order to kind of cover the back of this quilt. And so we're just going to add those up, right? 97 times 3, divide that by 36. That'll tell you your yardage. And then you, again, always want to round up to the nearest eighth or quarter. When you do that, you can kind of make the basic assumption that people are going to know how to just kind of lay this out. That's how most people would tend to do it if you don't give them any other instructions anyways. So there's no need to really write out in your pattern detailed instructions for assembling this kind of a backing. You just say, join your backing pieces and you're good to go. Now, if all of this sounds a little bit challenging, there's a lot going on here, worry not, I have your back. That is why I built Mathless Quilts. This is my online web app that will basically take in all of the information about your quilt and spit out cutting instructions and fabric requirements automatically for you. So there is a tool available if you don't like doing the math yourself. Go check it out. I'll leave the link in the description. Alrighty, that's all I've got for today. If you found this video helpful, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will be back next week, as always, with another Tech Tip Tuesday video. See ya!